Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Scott Levichter from Compliance Line. Thanks for joining us today. Really excited to have a conversation today about the known unknowns. We're going to talk today about elicitation and how we handle elicitation when it comes to hotline intake. And I have a great guest today. Miriam Taylor is joining us. Miriam's a longtime friend and mentor. And so we'll start out with it's going to be a casual conversation, talking about elicitation in the context, again, of risk management. And Miriam, why don't you give us a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll talk a bit, and we'll get started.
Sure. I'm Miriam Taylor. I worked with Scott years ago. As you can see on my LinkedIn, I spent 25 years at CIA. I was an operations officer in the pop culture vernacular. That's also called a case officer, but we don't really call it that anymore. As an operations officer, I spent a lot of time interacting with people on human intelligence to collect information. That is that crucial job that we do when we cannot collect information by other means. And other means usually means electronic, which is something that has developed heavily over the last several decades. I retired in 2017 from CIA, and now I work for a boutique professional services and training firm in Arlington, Virginia called FRDA. At FRDA, we provide training primarily for government and military clients on intelligence topics. So that's what I do today, and I spent a lot of time in my career working on elicitation, which is what we're going to be talking about today, as we talk about how you collect information from someone, whether they know you're doing it or not. But today we're going to be talking about when they actually know that you're doing it.
Yeah, today we're talking about the people who are raising their hand and volunteering to speak up about something in the workplace that concerns them, or perhaps they have an idea. And like Miriam, those of you who I haven't met yet on LinkedIn, my name is Scott Levichter. I'm Vice President and Head of Intelligent Intake Solutions at Compliance Line. Like Miriam, I spent the majority of my professional career at CIA doing initially as an investigator, but the majority of my 13 years, by far, actually 12 of those 13 years, was spent conducting operations, much like Miriam, as a case officer serving around the globe. After that, I kicked off a startup called Arbor Insight and developed a product that we're talking about in the background today, which is Askertech. It's the idea of bringing together subject matter experts like Miriam and I, who know how to conduct investigations and elicitations, and combining it with machine intelligence to conduct digitized, expert-driven online interviews. We're not going to focus on product today, though, Miriam. We're going to talk about it's this phrase I like to use a lot. It's not just what the user wants to say. So somebody in the workplace has a concern. They want to speak up. The majority of the digital first workforce is going to be would prefer to pick up an app and submit their concern via an app. We're trying to figure out then, how do we conduct that interview in a way that maximizes the information that our clients need to know to kick off an efficient, effective investigation and mitigation effort. I like to use the phrase, it's not just about what the employee or staff member wants to say, but it's about what our clients need to know. Can you talk about that phrase in the context of elicitation, how elicitation gets us to that need to know, that information that is in the brain of the person who wants to speak up, but they might not know is important?
Sure. So I'll frame this conversation with just touching on what elicitation is, and I want to talk about the 12 elicitation techniques. So elicitation is the act of engaging in what I call intentional conversation. It's knowing that there's a topic that's there. It might be something that you know you want to talk about, or it might be something that your interlocutor, the person speaking, wants to talk about. The way that humans communicate sometimes is circular, particularly if it's a topic that they're feeling sensitive about. So they might skirt the topic, they might inject other topics, known as sort of the the unintentional conversational hijacker. So when someone's feeling uncomfortable with the topic and they don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it's something they just don't want to talk about. And when it comes to what we're talking about in this interview today, that is a very real possibility. Could be something they're uncomfortable with. It could be a law violation issue. It could be a safety issue. It could be a whole variety of things that come across a desk in a compliance sphere. So elicitation is a way that I, as a communicator, can engage with my interlocutor, the person telling me the story, the person speaking, to guide that conversation, to make it intentional, to use techniques that the person might not even really know that I'm using in order to shape and guide the conversation where I want it to go. I'll continue unless you have a question.
No, I was just gonna say that's great because I like to use that rental car analogy, Miriam. I think you've heard me say that before, right? It's not the user driving the conversation. No
Right.
pun intended there, right? They're not trained to be investigators, compliance officers, ethics experts, right? They have something they want to say. They've made that often difficult choice to speak up, and now it's up to people like you and I to direct that conversation in a way that pulls out, that elicits information that we need to pass
Absolutely.
on. So, what are some of those techniques you mentioned?
Yeah, so elicitation techniques, there's 12 of them that we talk about in the world of intentional conversation. One thing I want to say before I talk about those is, everyone always, this is the joke, what's everyone's favorite topic? Themselves, right? And if it's not themselves, it's gossip. So number one, I want to talk about me. Number two, I want to talk about somebody else, right? So knowing that about how humans communicate is a really good framework to have. So encouraging that person to do the majority of the talking in a partner conversation will help you to get to crystallize, to synthesize the topics that are going to be on the table. Once you know what those topics are, you can start using these elicitation techniques. As I mentioned, there's 12. I'm going to talk about them briefly. But what I want to say in describing these techniques is that they're all things that we use already. They're all parts of our natural speech vernacular. As I go through them, audience members, you're going to recognize, oh, I say that a lot, or I do that. That's how I talk. The point of becoming aware of elicitation techniques is being able to use a skill you already have, but actually, as we like to say in our business, weaponizing it, using it intentionally, right? So let me just read a few of them to you. I have a super nice handout. If any of you ever want that one day, Scott can get it to you. But the techniques are, I'm going to read them. There's 12. I'll go slowly if you want to take notes. There's assumption. There's compare, contrast, confidences, deception, disagreement, flattery, fragmentary, give to get, incredulity, mild provocation, reference, and restate, reflect. So there's descriptions to each of those techniques that I can read just a few because I don't want to overtake this conversation with that academic explanation of these. But essentially, when you get to know these techniques, you'll see that some of these are very common in Western speech. Some of them are things that you as an individual might never use. I never use deception. Feels strange to me to use that style of interaction. I frequently use give to get. I frequently use flattery. Now, there's places in the world where flattery is really a sizable taboo. People don't feel comfortable when you use flattery. People also don't feel comfortable with incredulity or mild provocation. But if you've ever talked to anyone from the Northeast, that's kind of how New Yorkers talk. Not people from Michigan. We don't ever talk that way. But anyway, I'm just going to read you a couple so you can kind of get the understanding. Since I just mentioned incredulity, let's talk about that one. Incredulity uses an exclamatory statement in an effort to get your contact to respond in defense or in clarification. It sounds like this: I can't believe the company is really planning to take this action. So if the speaker has made a statement and you respond with incredulity, they usually start that way. I can't believe, fill in the blank.
Right.
The person will feel conversationally obligated to comment in one of two ways. They'll want to correct you. They'll want to underscore their own opinion because they've already made an exclamatory statement that you're responding to. So they'll feel defensive. I better say more to make sure this person understands what I'm saying, right? So that's one. Now the other one I want to touch on in the framework of our conversation today is give to get. So give to get is something that we use pretty often in American style speech. It's using your own experience to get your contact to share a little bit more. This technique makes your contact feel comfortable. They feel conversationally cared for, as we say. They feel that there's a connection between the two of you and that it's a casual exchange. Here's what it sounds like. I'm really interested to talk to you more about this expo. When I worked in Washington, I saw many of these events lead to great success. I had lots of positive interactions with other companies when I attended events like this. So that one's in a business context, but that's the concept of saying, hey, I like your opinion. Your opinion is interesting to me. I've had similar experiences with your opinion on this topic. And then that person feels flattered. It's a little bit a softer form of flattery, using give to get. Overuse of flattery can make you look really obsequious, with my favorite words. So it's really important to not overuse that. And the other one for this conversation that we're having today is confidences. I want to just briefly touch on. It's used to imply an intimacy and a trustworthiness in a conversation in order to get your contact to share more details. Again, this is in a business context, but you can modify this style to something that you need it to be really in any setting. Sounds like this. This isn't widely known, but the company is focused on making sure that we are well positioned to participate in the business expo and be competitive. We're putting in some other plans in place to make sure that we can compete against some of our primary competitors. Saying this isn't widely known, we haven't really done any releases on this. This is something new coming up, but I'm going to share it with you. That's that confidences moment. And that makes the person feel like, this person trusts me. This person is valuing what I'm saying. So I think I can say more, right?
Those are great points. And it reminds me a bit of a certain training class I had many, many moons ago at a certain place, where we learned how to do our craft, right? And in the context of ethics and compliance, I've certainly done my share of investigations, especially with the ethics compliance team, where building confidence with our subjects in order to get them to reveal a bit more about the wider context of what they're observing, what they may be involved in. Whether it's an FCPA issue or export issue, these techniques apply pretty directly. And I don't see that a lot of people have, and probably not surprisingly so, given the uniqueness of our training, but not a lot of people are applying these techniques in that space because they're not necessarily trained to be investigators. They're not trained intelligence officers. When you think about the compliance and ethics space, which you've had some exposure to working with myself over the last few years, what are some of these 12 techniques that you think apply best to that space where somebody's raising their hand about a difficult workplace issue?
Right. Well, I really think that the confidences technique would work really well in this space, because if you think about a person who's coming forward to report on something that's sensitive, and there's a whole, variety of topics in the compliance field that would fall into that category of sensitive, right? Confidences work really well. The other one that can work really well is assumption. We didn't talk about that one yet, but assumption makes a statement that forces your contact to comment or to correct you, right? So if a person is doing that circuitous talking because they don't want to really get at the point and they're unintentionally conversationally hijacking, you can use assumption to get them back on track. And you also can couple these together. You can do the combo. So you can use restate, reflect with assumption, and it would sound something like this. You said a few minutes ago, that's the restate, reflect, and then you regurgitate what the person said to you. You have to be a really good listener when you're doing interviews like this, when you're trying to use elicitation techniques, because deciding where they go is very strategic. But let me get back to my example. You can say, you said a few minutes ago, there's restate, reflect, that you feel, use the person's exact phrase, and then couple it with assumption. I assume, and when you use assumption, it always has, I expect, or I assume you feel this way because. So it's a moment of vulnerability as the interviewer. You're saying, I think you're saying this, and I'm going to go out on a limb. And so that's the combination of two of those. You said a little bit ago, so I'm going to remind you, speaker, that you said this. And this is exactly what you said. And I'm going to assume you feel that way because, and then they have to correct you. They have to confirm, yes, I feel exactly that way because, and then we're back to the issue of what people love to talk about themselves. And if they're not talking about themselves, they like to talk about somebody else. It's self and gossip. Those are the two primary topics.
Right.
So that's one way in this space that you can get someone to continue to talk about what it is that you want them to talk about. I mentioned a couple of times now the circuitous talking that people sometimes do when there's a topic they know they need to talk about, but they don't really want to talk about. It's conversational procrastination, right? Obfuscation. That's when restate, reflect can also come in really well to get your agenda back on track. A lot of people who are new to this type of interaction, they think that demonstrating the act of listening, of being a good listener, means that you sit quietly and absorb what the person's saying, that you become sponge-like. That's exactly the opposite thing to do. In our world, we talk about being the trampoline, not the sponge. So the sponge is the person that uses a lot of nonverbal conversational enhancers like, oh, wow, and they think they're demonstrating good listening skills by doing these kinds of short little sounds, right? But in fact, a speaker, you just did it to me. In fact, a speaker will feel better if you trampoline. So go ahead, Scott, trampoline.
No, I was going to trampoline, but I think I love that you're talking about here is that circuitous route, right? And that goes back to, that if we translate this into the software realm, right? We can't have that necessarily have that give and take, right? There's a path we're providing, and so that direction and that strategy and how we digitize that expert interview. So we're thinking about a use case, we're thinking about a persona, we're thinking about a scenario. Right. We have to consider all that at once when we're trying to take this elicitation technique, this elicitation process, and build it into a piece of software or an online form experience, right? And I love how you mentioned strategic, because as we talk about the right question in the right order at the right time, a lot of compliance line, right? And how that affects and impacts interview and the results of the interview, not just from the information you get, but from the user experience, which is incredibly important. I think that there's a study out there that says when people conduct an online interview via a mobile device, precision increases, disclosure increases, and satisfaction of the user increases. And if we're talking about pairing that then with an elicitation interview, it's a pretty powerful mechanism to take that hotline intake that I think we'd all prefer that to be done in person, right? As human people, as investigators, we'd love to have that face-to-face. There's nothing that's ever going to replace that as a primary means of elicitation or investigation query. But if we can mimic that via a piece of software, I think it's an incredibly powerful tool. And I'd like you to talk a bit about that the directed, strategic way that you would conduct an elicitation interview, and maybe touch a bit about how you might amend that for an online experience where you're not there present real time.
Yeah, so that's a super interesting topic to me, Scott, because 80% of our communication is nonverbal. Well, a phone or a computer or whatever interface can't see the nonverbals because that entity is non-human. So when you think about, how you migrate that in-person interview and use elicitation into a digital sphere, one of the main things that goes away immediately are the nonverbals, right? So the speaker, the volunteer, can't do some of those things that he or she would do in an in-person interview. And I'm talking about things like yellow and red lights in a conversation. If you're having a human interview, you see these nonverbals. They look like a yellow light, is when someone doesn't want to talk more about the topic that really they came to volunteer to talk about because it's uncomfortable. So they're doing that obfuscation thing. And a yellow light, when an interview asks a question, looks like this. Usually there's a hand to the face. It's kind of like, the eyes go this way. Maybe bite their nail, like, oh, there's all those nonverbals, like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. Now,
so we call that user experience in the software realm, designing around that.
Yeah. So even though I eschew the idea that a computer can do this better than I can, is sometimes the interesting thing that I have discovered and our COVID year brought us this in great clarity, that people are actually a little bit more comfortable and they'll share more in a virtual space, even if they're seeing another person through the camera, and even more so if they're not seeing anyone, because some of those nonverbals and yellow and red lights go away.
Right.
You can't yellow light a computer. It doesn't care that you're having a yellow light moment. So you have to figure out, when you're building these algorithms, what's the best question tree to build for an elicitation thread. When someone brings up this or that topic, the next follow-up question could be an elicitation technique, or it could be a direct question. And we haven't really talked about direct questions yet.
And I'd like to get into that. I think it was interesting to me many months ago when we looked at how I would construct an interview for an online elicitation and how you would. And I noted how I defaulted to asking who else was involved pretty early in the conversation, pretty consistently.
Right.
Whereas when we talked about how you constructed an interview for this digital space, you put who else was involved usually towards the end, if I remember correctly, because we have to consider, well, that person might not want to talk about that. That's maybe a big barrier. And these are some of the things that I think people don't really appreciate about online forums. Online forums are a bunch of direct questions that are not nuanced. And if you talk about customizing them, there might be groups of questions, but it doesn't compare still to that elicitation by an expert. So, but you were going to talk about those direct questions and how they fit into this online, this digitized experience.
Right. And so you just mentioned something that all of us have felt. When you're doing something that's electronic, some digital interview, an online training, whatever it is, you might experience a much greater degree of direct questions, more frequent in your experience, in your interaction, and potentially more bundled together in a tight grouping than you would in a personal interaction. And again, that's taking away that digital space, doesn't recognize a yellow or a red light. That it doesn't recognize the nonverbals that you're giving off when you're trying to share information. So when you're having an in-person interaction, you can often couple these by using an elicitation technique. Person talks, gives a lot of detail. You have to actively listen, and you have to find that moment that you can follow up with a direct question right on the heels of all the information that just came out, because it feels natural. The person who's speaking is expecting a direct question after sharing all these details. Elicitation techniques really are designed to a few things: make the person feel comfortable, make them feel conversationally cared for. And what that means, it sounds super new agey, but what that means is the person feels like you're really interested in what they have to say. You are very much paying close attention to what they have to say because they're really interesting, because that's what we all think about ourselves when we're talking. We're the most interesting men and women on the planet, right? So when someone uses an elicitation technique, it gives me, the speaker, the feeling that, wow, they're really listening to me. They really understand me. They're really focusing on the information I'm sharing, because they're able to parrot it back to me when we use like restate, reflect, to get me to talk more. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk more because I'm talking about me, because I like to talk about me, right? That's what's going through someone's head. And then when you're doing this in person, that's when you follow up with that direct question. We call it in our world the conversational funnel. So if you think about funnel, it's big and it goes skinny and it goes big again. So you have all these elicitation techniques in the top, and then you have that narrow space where you're asking those direct questions as follow-up. Then you branch out in the funnel again and ask more elicitation technique style questions to get the person to continue to talk more, because your wealth is in how much they say. So now comparing that to the digital space, we're all super expectant that when we have a digital interaction, we're going to have a lot of direct questions. So when you're able to intersperse the natural density of direct questions in a digital interaction, that elicitation experience really stands out. It's kind of the opposite of that human interaction. Humans, we use elicitation techniques all day long. It's how we talk. And then you intersperse a direct question here and there, doesn't feel uncomfortable. If you barrage a human with direct questions in an in-person exchange, it feels like an interview. And sometimes it feels like an interrogation. It's too much. But the flip side is true of that digital experience. You're expectant of all these direct questions. So when the computer, the app, whatever platform it is, asks you something using an elicitation technique and not a 5W&H question, you're surprised. And you're like, oh, well, that's an interesting response to the things I just said. Sure, I can, share more details on that.
Right. So getting behind, and I love that. And I'm trained in this. I did it for 15 years, and I'm still sitting here like I'm learning it for the first time. You're great at it. You're an absolute natural. But speaking of natural and comfortable, interspersing, as you said, these direct questions with, considering the persona. If you're, building a software tool or an intelligent intake, as we call it, you're considering that persona. You're considering that scenario. You're considering the context, right? So that these subtle changes of asking a more nuanced question as a follow-up then provides that more comfortable, that more natural experience for the user, leading to even more precision and satisfaction and disclosure, which, for the compliance and ethics and investigations professionals that are tuning in this afternoon, that's going to lead to a more robust contextual report, right? So, because we're talking here about augmenting those folks, right? We're not obviously never going to replace them, but we can augment them. Like I use the analogy, an ATM in a bank or a kiosk at the airport. If we can augment them by allowing them to focus on other things, maybe the follow-on investigation or other casework, right?
Yeah.
Then we're providing value both to the staff member they're having a better experience, they're able to better express themselves, and then we're uncovering and capturing that actionable contextual detail that leads to a more efficient, effective response process, whether it's an investigation or more questions or a follow-on. How would you, as we begin to wrap up, because we could go on for hours talking about this, I would enjoy that quite immensely. How would you compare and contrast, just to be very blunt about it, the question grouping you see in a form? You know, we say many people say I have a form, I can customize that. How do you compare that to the nuance that you can express through an elicitation interview, even if it's constrained somewhat in the digitized, the software world?
Well, as we talked about a minute ago, you know, when you have that, and if I'm not getting at the exact answer to your question, Scott, stop me and rephrase, but I think I understand. You know, when you have that form in front of you and you have these groupings of questions, I mentioned a minute ago that I just tossed it out there, the 5WH. I mean, as experienced compliance ethics interviewers, everyone knows what that means. But if there's someone in the audience that doesn't know, it's the who, what, when, where, why, how. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Yeah, that's there's a count out. So you know, you can group those direct questions in an online fashion based on those primary 5WH headings, right? Because they'll often branch out. It's like a question tree. It branches out to other things. And as I mentioned, when I'm doing an interview and I know there's 5WH information I need to collect, I always start my interviews with an elicitation techniques, always. And then when I find that moment, and we call it in our world the conversational gait, when that person presents that conversational gait, then it's your job as the interviewer, as the information collector, to go through the gate, right? That's the moment for the direct question. And in a personal interview, that's when you might get that yellow light. It might be too soon. The person might not want to talk about it yet. They might give you all those nonverbals like, oh, I don't know. Or they might give you the red, which is, I don't want to talk about that. Huh. And then you kind of know, okay, I'm just going to set that one aside for a minute. That doesn't mean that topic's over. So let's go back to what you said a minute ago, the interview that happens digitally is step one. And then the human comes and takes those results, reviews those results, and then takes those results to have the in-person interview. So that is like the absolute perfect moment to use some of the elicitation techniques where you see holes in what the person didn't want to talk about. You can see the red lights in the digital interview. You can see where they gave little to no detail, or they said, I don't have all the information right now, or some obfuscation, right? And then you can kind of use restate reflect as an elicitation technique instead of saying, you know, on question 72, well, there's probably not that many questions, are there?
You see my eyes? That would be a horrible user experience. Question 73.
On question 73, you mentioned.
Tell us more about that.
And so, you know, to make that user feel comfortable, you know, instead of having it be an accusatory tone, you didn't give a lot of details on question 72, right? You can use elicitation techniques and you start with the topic, right? So question 72 might have been, who else was involved, since you mentioned that. And people sometimes are scared to call out others because they'll get in trouble. They could get fired, whatever could happen, right? Censured, whatever could happen, whatever the penalty is. So, you know, you can get at some of those details by saying, thank you for coming, you know, thank you for doing your interview through the app, through the enterprise system, whatever it is. I want to go through some follow-up with you. And you mentioned reference. You mentioned that you were not the only person who, was involved, who have experience with this. Maybe you can share with me, or flattery. I'd love to hear more detail from you on why you think, and there's the direct question, this is a pervasive issue. So then you're talking about the issue, not the person calling out who else was there, because you can get back to that later. You just got to get the person comfortable talking.
That's a great point. I mean, getting them talking and getting that great first experience, right? And what a way to set the table, though, right? So if you're talking about a piece of software that focuses on the elicitation technique and making somebody comfortable with an interaction, and then following that up with the ability for an investigator, compliance, ethics officer to look at that contextual report and be able to then apply their elicitation techniques to that.
Yeah.
Follow up. If I hadn't helped create the tool, I sure would have loved to use it when I was still in the industry as an investigator. Because it would help me certainly kick off an investigation by being able to say, all right, there's somebody else involved, and there's some nuance to that, and it's going to affect how I scope an investigative process. It's going to affect how I structure my interviews in terms of who I speak with first. It's going to give me some idea of tone, of reluctance, of gaming issues, as you mentioned. And so being able to pair this, I focus in my comments here on the software piece of it, understandably so, but you're being mindful of the fact that pairing an elicitation approach online and in person is an incredibly powerful tool.
Right. Well, it in fact allows you to do something we haven't talked about yet, which maybe should be our second chapter of this fun conversation.
Great.
Is about conversational mapping. We talk a lot about that in our world. It's literally planning your chess game with what you're going to say and how you're going to get topics on the table with elicitation. Usually, mapping can happen when you've had numerous interactions with someone, right? If we're talking about the intelligence collection world, you've met someone numerous times, and you remember all these things that the person has said over the various meetings. And so you map out how you want the conversation to flow. We actually, in our business, and I'm sure you remember doing this, Scott, you stand there in your kitchen and you have like this whole conversation of how you think that the conversation is going to go when you get in that meeting, because you're mapping and you're planning. I'm going to bring up this that he said before. It's a restate, reflect. It's a proclamation the person made, making a public pronouncement, we call it. You can't walk back from that. When you make a pronouncement, and I'm going to remind you of it. Hey, remember that when we met a month ago and you said blah, and then flattery. I'm really interested in your opinion on that because reference, I read in the newspaper that blah, blah, blah. So you can bundle all these, but you have to be ready. So if you have all that data from an online experience that a user had, you literally can sit down and map out something using these techniques that are going to make it really, really effective.
That's an incredible point. I really appreciate you making that. And now I'm reflecting back on various places I've served, to include the private sector, and thinking about having these whole conversations with this other person before I go into the room, based on what we know before. Don't do it as much these days, but exactly what we're trying to do, though, for those that we're serving, right? It's giving them a great jumping off point for that more efficient, effective response. And I think you're certainly referring to a kind of an advanced class there that I think our audience might enjoy. So we'll have to look at that as the next step.
We could make it a 2-day, and we could do it in person for a very affordable price.
So closing comments. So we've had a great conversation. We've touched on at a high level, very high level, as our audience might imagine, these 12 different techniques. We've talked about conversation mapping. We've talked about how that can be generally applied to an online intake experience, and how that benefits both the user from, they're being guided through it, and they're being made comfortable, and that leads to precision, disclosure, and satisfaction, right? And we've talked and we've talked a little bit about the benefits for our compliance and ethics brothers and sisters that they then can kick off that human interaction on a more solid footing. Final comments might you offer to our audience here today, Miriam? You've made a great number of points that I'm not going to try and summarize here. You'd be foolhardy, but some final comments here about that elicitation bridge between human and the digital world.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we can go back to the beginning. I spent my career in getting humans to tell me information, right? And you said this, Scott, there's no replacement for the human in this world, but there absolutely is a role for digital interaction for a user that feels the need to come forward with some information, followed by the in-person. I think, and as I mentioned, in this COVID year, I've been amazed to see how it's this paradox that you have this barrier between you and your person you're talking to. You and I are talking, but through two computer screens. I can't reach out and touch you. I want to try, but I can't do it, right? Because we have this barrier. So you would think that the barrier would cause people to feel uncomfortable, to not feel as comfortable with sharing. But the reality is the barrier makes people feel a little braver, a little more comfortable sharing. And, for our third topic that we should talk about, it's the phenomenon of people's willingness to share in that anonymous space. And that's caused a lot of problems in personal relationships on social media, right? We've all seen it this year. But it's a fascinating paradox to me that when you have this barrier between two humans, the person feels more comfortable to share. And when they get face to face, they feel a little bit more uncomfortable. I'm sure a lot of it has to go in the buckets of judgment. People feel like they might be judged. People feel uncomfortable with sharing in a face-to-face manner. But I really feel like that a way to move forward with the types of folks that we're talking about who want to come forward with information, excuse me, I've been sick, is just a cold. I don't have COVID. Is to start with that digital experience and then move live. Because, that's the interesting thing I said a minute ago about the public pronouncement when someone makes some statement, right? And as collectors, we have to remember what it was exactly, right? As a quote. Now that's easy for us to do because we're in the world of collecting information and we write a lot of stuff down and we can remember. But when it's there on paper, someone has actually written down something that is pronouncement-like, you can take that absolutely. And without saying, you wrote here on this paper that you said, you don't have to do it that way, but you absolutely can call it out and use it in your map to decide how you're going to approach that first human interaction with that volunteer.
So thank you so much for that, Miriam. We've covered, I think we've offered our audience a lot of great value in our conversation today, and I really appreciate that about you and our time today. Our profiles are just a click away. So if you're looking at, elicitation, Miriam is available. If you're looking to explore more about how we use this elicitation technique we've talked about today to power a better workplace world, to serve our clients and their workforce, you can certainly come to my profile, Compliance Lines online, also on LinkedIn, or of course you can go to complianceline.com and look at the Intelligent Intake app. So it sounds like we'll be back, Miriam, for some more chats, and I look forward to that.
That'd be really fun.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I really appreciate you joining me today, Miriam, for a really fun conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.